In the last video of our old SAT farewell tour, we're going to look at a math tactics video on percents and on translating percents. So when you're given a word problem and you need to solve for a percent or some fraction that comes from a percent or whatever it might be, being able to translate your text from the word problem into an equation which you can then solve is really useful because it turns percent problems, it turns the whole issue with percent problems about do I multiply, do I divide, which ones do I multiply, which ones do I divide? It turns that into an equation, which you can then solve pretty easily if you can do algebra. So we're going to show a bunch of questions from real SATs in this. So as always, pause the video whenever a question is presented, try it yourself first, and then watch my solution. All right, let me know what you think. One of the best ways to solve SAT percent problems is to translate the words into equations and then solve the equations. I talked about how to do this in the SAT bootcamp, so now let's actually look at some examples from real SATs. If 0.03% of n is 3, what is 3% of n? So notice the answers here, we want to figure out what 3% of n is. So that is what these represent. So if you plug these in as n, be very careful because you might be falling for a mistake. Instead, we need to figure out what is 3% of n once we get it. Now in theory, you could use these and work backwards to get to the answer, but instead of doing that, let's just go ahead and translate into an equation. So first, if 0.03% of, so 0.03%, now don't make this 0.03 as your decimal. It has to be 0.0003, because remember, to change this into a decimal from a percent, you got to move your decimal point over 2 places. So this is 0.0003 of n, so times n is 3. So now we go ahead and solve for n. Do that, 3 divided by 0.0003 gets us 10,000. So n is 10,000, but now we want to know what is 3% of n. So now we do 0.03 times 10,000, right? Because it's 3%, so we just change it to a decimal, and we get 300, which is choice C and the answer. Notice as well that you can kind of see, well, this is 0.03%, this is 3%. To go from one to the other, I could just move the decimal point over 2 spaces. And similarly, I would move this decimal point over 2 places and I get 300 as well. So that's a little mini shortcut. It doesn't work on every problem. I mean, it might work on other problems, but I think the best thing to remember to do is translate this into an equation and solve it that way, because that for sure is going to work on a lot of percent problems. Let's look at this next one. If 75% of m is equal to k percent of 25, where k is greater than 0, what is the value of m over k? So in theory, we could, I suppose, try plugging in values here, right? So m would be 3 and k would be 16, and then you would do the math there. So you can plug in, but I'm going to, again, translate them into equations. 75% of m. So this is going to be 0.75 of m, so times m, is equal to k percent of 25. So how do we turn this into a decimal? Well, it's a bit hard, right? We can't do 0.0k. That doesn't really make much sense. So instead, what we can do is just write it as k over 100, right? Because that's the same thing as the decimal, or whatever this number is, we're going to divide it by 100, and that's the same thing as moving over the decimal point 2 places. So we can do that. Times 25, because it's of 25. And now we just want to rearrange this to get m over k, right? So let's go ahead and do that. So m over k, doing a little rearranging here, we're going to get 0.25 over 0.75, which is 1/3, which is the answer to the question. So this is a number 18. This is a 4 out of 5 in difficulty. So overall, a pretty hard question, but once you translate it and, make sure you translate it correctly, right? Make sure your percents are proper decimals, all those kinds of things. You can get down to the answer pretty easily. Notice they want the ratio, so you can just solve for m over k. You don't have to solve for m individually or k individually, just them together. So the answer to 18 is B. Let's look at one more. In a certain store, the regular price of a refrigerator is $600. How much money is saved by buying this refrigerator at 20% off the regular price, rather than buying it on sale at 10% off the regular price, with an additional 10% additional discount of 10% off the sale price? So notice what they're saying here is you have some item cost $600. We can either get a 20% discount right off the top, or we can get a 10% discount on top of another 10% discount. So you might say, well, isn't this going to be the same thing? Well, no, the problem itself is saying that we're going to save more money this way than we will this way, because percents are not additive in the way you might expect. So we want to figure out, well, how much is going to be saved more in the 20% way than the 10% way. So let's figure out first, what's 20% of 600, right? That will tell us how much is saved. So 0.20 of times 600 is, so we can go ahead, pop that in. We get 120. So that's how many dollars are saved just by going the 10% method, the 20% route. What about this? Well, we're taking 10% of 10% of 600. So the first thing we really need to do is let's do 10% of 600. So 10% of 600. And when we do this, we're going to get 60. But then note, we're going to take another 10% off this. So we're already saving 60. But then we're going to take 10% off of the new price, right? We're going to take 10% off of the new price, which is 540. Right? Because we're getting a 10% discount and then another 10% off the top. And 10% of that is 54. So the total amount we're actually saving is these two together, which is 114. So notice in this method, we saved $120. Here we saved 114. So what's the difference? Well, the difference, as you might expect, is 6. And that is the answer to the question. So this one's a bit different than the others because you're not simply just translating something that comes from the problem. You have to kind of create the word problem in your head and then translate it on paper as shown below. Let's think if there's another way to do it. Probably not. This is probably the best way to do it. If you can think of any other ways to do it, let me know. But again, translating is going to be your go-to method for a lot of percent problems. To learn more about Reason Prep's SAT, SAT subject test, and ACT video courses, go to reasonprep.com/enroll, and you can find the link in the description below the video.